Section number 2 of Scientific American Supplement number 795, March 28, 1891. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Colton Wooten. Scientific American Supplement number 795, March 28, 1891, by Various. The Business End of the American Newspaper. Footnote 1. A recent address before the Outlook Club of Montclair, New Jersey, by A.H. Siegfried. Part 1. The controlling motive and direct purpose of the average newspaper are financial profit. One is now and then founded, and conducted even at a loss, to serve party, social, religious, or other ends. But where the primary intent is unselfish, there remains hope for monetary gain. The first newspapers never dreamed of teaching or influencing men, but were made to collect news and entertainment and deal in them as in any other commodity. But because this was the work of intelligence upon intelligence, and because of conditions inherent in this kind of business, it soon took higher form and service, and came into responsibilities of which, in its origin, it had taken no thought. Wingate's Views and Interviews on Journalism gives the opinions of the leading editors and publishers of 15 years ago upon this point of newspaper motive and work. The first notable utterance was by Mr. Whitelaw Reid, who said the idea and object of the modern daily newspaper are to collect and give news, with the promptest and best elucidation and discussion thereof. That is, the selling of these in the open market, primarily a merchant of news. Substantially and distinctly, the same ideas were given by William Cullen Bryant, Henry Watterson, Samuel Bowles, Charles A. Dana, Henry J. Raymond, Horace White, David G. Crowley, Murat Halstead, Frederick Hudson, George William Curtis, E. L. Godkin, Manton Marble, Park Godwin, George W. Smalley, James Gordon Bennett, and Horace Greeley. The book is fat with discussion by these and other eminent newspaper men as to the motives, methods, and ethics of their profession, disclosing high ideals and genuine seeking of good for all the world. But the whole of it at last rests upon primary motives and controlling principles, in no wise different or better or worse than those of the produce exchange and the dry goods district of Wall Street and Broadway, so that, taking publications in the lump, it is neither untrue nor ungenerous, nor, when fully considered, is it surprising to say that the world's doing, fact and fancy, are collected, reported, discussed, scandalized, condemned, commended, supported, and turned back upon the world as the publisher's merchandise. The force and reach of this controlling motive allude to the reckoning of the closest observation and ripest experience. But as somewhat measuring its strength and pervasiveness, hear, and for a moment think, of these facts and figures. The American Newspaper Directory for 1890, accepted as the standard compiler and analyst of newspaper statistics, gives as the number of regularly issued publications in the United States and Territories, 17,760. Then we know that these have an aggregate circulation for each separate issue, not for each week, or month, or for a year, but for each separate issue of each individual publication, a total of 41,524,000 copies, many of them repeating themselves each day, some each alternate day, some each third day, and the remainder each week, month, or quarter, and that in a single year they produce 3,481,610,000 copies. Knowing, though dimly realizing, this tremendous output, we have some faint impression of the numerical strength of this mighty force which holds close relation to and bears strong influence upon life, thought, and work, and which, measured by its units, is as the June leaves on the trees, and its vast aggregate almost inconceivable, a force expansive, aggressive, pervasive, going everywhere, stopping nowhere, ceasing never. I am to speak to you of the business end of the American newspaper. That is, of the work of the publishers' department, not the editors. At the outset, I am confronted with divisions and subdivisions of the subject so many and so far-reaching that right regard for time compels the merest generalization. But, as best I can, and as briefly as I can, I shall speak upon the topic under three general divisions. First, the personal and material forces which make the newspaper. Second, the sources of revenue from the joint working of these forces. Third, the direct office, bearing, and influence of these forces. It is but natural that the general public has a limited idea of the personality and mechanism of the publication business, for much of its movement is at night, and there is separation and isolation of departments, as well as complicated relation of the several parts to the whole. Not many years ago, a very few men and boys could edit, print, and distribute the most important of newspapers, where now hundreds are necessary parts in a tremendous complexity. But even today, of the nearly 18,000 publications in the United States, more than 11,000 are of that class which, in all their departments, are operated by from 2 to 4 or 5 persons, and which furnish scant remuneration even for these. Among the thin populations and in the remote regions are thousands of weekly papers, and you may spell the weekly either with a double E or an EA, where there are 2 men and a boy, one of whom does little writing and much scissoring, loafing among the corner groceries and worse, begging for subscribers, buttonholing for advertisements, and occasionally and indiscriminately thrashing or being thrashed by the esteemed contemporary or the outraged citizen. The second of whom sets the type, reads the proofs, corrects them more or less, makes the rollers, works the old hand-press, and curses the editor and the boy impartially, and the third of whom sweeps the office weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, inks the forms and sometimes pies them, carries the papers, and does generally the humble and diversified works of the printer's devil, while between the three the whole thing periodically goes to the level, pretty sure to be reached now and then by papers of this class. Yet there are many of these country papers that Mr. Watterson once styled the rural roosters, which are useful and honored, and which actively employ as editors and publishers men of fair culture and good common sense, with typographical and mechanical assistants who are worthy of their craft. But the personal workers upon the great magazines and the daily newspapers are for each a battalion or a regiment, and in the aggregate a vast army. The Century magazine regularly employs in its editorial department 3 editors and 8 editorial assistants, of whom 5 are women. In the art department, 2 artists in charge and 4 assistants, of whom 3 are women. In the business department, 58 persons, men and women, a total of 76 persons employed on the magazine regularly and wholly, while the printers and binders engaged in preparing a monthly edition of 200,000 magazines are at least a duplicate of the number engaged in the editorial, art, and business divisions. The actual working force upon the average large daily newspaper, as well as an outline idea of the work done in each department, and of its unified result in the printed sheet, as such newspapers are operated in New York, Chicago, and Boston, may be realized from an exhibit of the exact current status and the establishment of a well-known Chicago paper. In its editorial department, there are the editor-in-chief, managing editors, city editors, telegraph editors, exchange editors, editorial writers, special writers, and about 30 reporters, 56 in all. Working in direct connection with this department, and as part of it, are 3 telegraph operators and 9 artists, etchers, photographers, and engravers. In the Washington office, 3 staff correspondents, and in the Milwaukee office 1 such correspondent, making for what Mr. Bennett calls the intellectual end a force of 72 men, who are usually regarded by the business end as a necessary evil, to be fed and clothed, but on the whole as hardly worth the counting. In the business and mechanical departments, the men and women in their work are these: the business office for general clerical work, receiving and caring for advertisements, receiving and dispersing cash, and for the general bookkeeping, employs 24 men and women. On the city circulation, stimulating and managing it within the city and the immediate vicinity, 10 persons. On the country circulation, for handling all out-of-town subscriptions and orders of wholesale newsagents, 30 persons. on mailing and delivery for sending out by mail and express of the outside circulation, and for distribution to city agents and newsboys, 31 persons. In the New York office, caring for the paper's business throughout the East, the Canadas, Great Britain, and Europe, 2 persons. In the composing room, where the copy is put into type, and in the linotype room, where a part of the typesetting is done by machinery, 95 persons. In the stereotype foundry, where the plates are cast, for the type itself never is put on the press, 11 persons. In the press room, where the printing, folding, cutting, pasting, and counting of the papers is done, 30 persons. In the engine and dynamo room, 8 persons. In the care of the building, 3 persons. These numbers include only the minimum and always necessary force, and make an aggregate of 316 persons daily and nightly engaged for their entire working time, and borne on a payroll of $6,000 a week for salaries and wages alone. But this takes no account of special correspondence subject to instant call in several hundred places throughout the country, of European correspondence, of 1,900 newsagents throughout the West, of 200 city carriers, of 42 wholesale city dealers with their horses and wagons, of 200 branch advertisement offices throughout the city, all connected with the main office by telephone, and of more than 3,000 newsboy ash, all making their living in whole or in part from work upon or business relations with this one paper, a little army of 6,300 men, women, and children, producing and distributing but one of the 1,626 daily newspapers in the United States. The leading material forces in newspaper production are type, paper, and presses. Printing types are cast from a composition which is made 1/2 of lead, 1/4 of tin, and 1/4 of antimony, though these proportions are slightly reduced, so as to admit what the chemist calls of copper a trace, the sum of these parts aiming at a metal which shall be hard, yet not brittle, ductile, yet tough, flowing freely, yet hardening quickly. Body type, that is, those classes ever seen in ordinary print, aside from display and fancy styles, is in 13 classes, the smallest technically called brilliant, and the largest great primer. In the reading columns of newspapers, but 4 classes are ordinarily used: agate for the small advertisements, agate, nonpareil, and minion for news, miscellany, etc., and minion and brevier for editorials, the minion being used for what are called minor editorials, and the brevier for leading articles, as to which it may be said that young editorial writers consider life very real and very earnest, until they are promoted from minion to brevier. A complete assortment of any one of these classes is called a font, the average weight of which is about 800 pounds. Whereas our alphabet has 26 letters, the compositor must really use of letters, spaces, accent marks, and other characters in an English font 152 distinct types, and in each font there are 195,000 individual pieces. The largest number of letters in a font belongs to small e, 12,000, and the least number to the z, 200. The letters, characters, spaces, etc. are distributed by the printer in a pair of cases. The upper one for capitals, small capitals, and various characters, having 98 boxes, and the lower one for the small letters, punctuation marks, etc.